Hi! So welcome back to my beat tracking masterclass part 2. So last time I talked about onset detection, and today I'm going to talk about tempo tracking or tempo estimation. And the method that I'm using to do that is described in this paper, and this is state-of-the-art. And I'm not going to describe in detail the algorithm that they're using in this paper. I think you just have to read the paper, but maybe as a very broad overview, I can say that what they're doing is they're taking the onset signal, which I described in my last video, and they're looking for repetitions in the signal, or they're looking for periodicity in the signal. So if you take that onset signal and you take a copy of the onset signal, how far do you have to shift that copy in time before it more or less lines up with itself again? Okay, and so that amount of shift tells you what the tempo of the music is. And so what I want to do is just demonstrate this algorithm for you. And so in my little demo window here, what I have here is a plot of what the most likely tempo is. So with slower tempos being on the right and faster tempos being on the left. And the peak value of whatever is being plotted here is what the tempo is assumed to be. And so this gray box here just tells you actually what the tempo is. And so I'll play some music for you. There's this guy on YouTube, Jim Dooley, who has all of these drum loops, and it's convenient because he tells you what the tempo of each drum loop is. So here's one that he's telling us is 85 beats a minute. And there you go. My algorithm is telling us 85 beats a minute. Here's another one. He's saying this is 125 beats a minute. Okay, maybe let's do another one. Here's one he's saying is 78 beats a minute. Good, and then let's see if we can find a slower one. This is 60 beats a minute. Okay, so this is telling us it's 120 beats a minute, so it's doubled the true tempo. It was trying to make a little spike here at 60 beats a minute, but 120 beats a minute won out. And that's pretty common with this algorithm, that you'll get either double or half of what the ground truth tempo is, but still not bad. And so this algorithm works pretty well on actual complete pieces of music as well. I'll show a little bit more of that in my next video. And maybe right now I'll just play one more example for you of an actual piece of music. And this is interesting because there's a section in this music where the tempo gradually increases. In fact, it starts at about 130 beats a minute, and it increases over the course of 30 or 40 seconds until the tempo is actually doubled, at which point they just then continue with the song like nothing happened. Okay, so this is from Die Antwoord, and I think this is fair use because it's less than 10% and it's for educational purposes. So yeah, what you'll see in the graph here is it should lock onto 130 beats a minute pretty quickly, and then as the tempo increases, at some point this will divide the tempo in half and then keep increasing until it's back up to 130. So there you go, 130. increasing. So now it's trying to jump down. And so finally back up to 130. So it struggles a little bit at that moment where it shifts down by half, but overall it actually tracks the changing tempo quite well. So now I want to do what I did in the last video and show you what some of the different parameters do. So first of all, there's an autocorrelation exponent. The first part of the algorithm described in this paper does an autocorrelation on the onset signal. Normal autocorrelation, you take the Fourier transform of the signal and square it. In generalized autocorrelation, you take the Fourier transform of the signal and you raise it to some other power. And in the paper, they suggest raising it to the power of 0.5. So I guess they're technically taking the square root. And that is something that seems to work pretty well, and I haven't played around with it too much, but I don't think there's any reason to change that. So you can set the minimum and maximum tempo. So here by default we're searching for tempos in the range from 50 to 200 beats a minute, but you could search for a broader or narrow tempo range if you wanted to. The caveat being that the broader your range is, the more likely you are to get these harmonics of the true tempo at extreme tempo values. So you kind of want to keep this as restricted as you expect the range of music that you're interested in to be. So you can set the min tempo and the max tempo. I don't think I need to demonstrate that. That's pretty straightforward. So tempo candidates, again, in this paper, they choose 10 things that they think might be the tempo, and then they score them. And the one with the highest score wins. And the scoring of tempo candidates is one of the most computationally intensive parts of the whole algorithm. I think the whole beat tracking thing that I implemented runs in about 20% of real time on my computer, and about 7% of real time is spent just scoring tempo candidates. So if you're trying to run this algorithm on, say, an embedded Linux computer that's not that powerful, you might consider lowering the number of tempo candidates that need to be scored. I saw one paper for a real-time beat tracker where they're using the same tempo estimation method, and they suggested using 5 tempo candidates. If you have fewer tempo candidates, then you'll get more spurious tempo estimates, which you'll have to try to minimize out. But yeah, 10 seems to work fine. I'm guessing that 5 probably works fine as well, although again, this is something that I haven't played around with that much. So Gaussian tempo histogram decay. So this thing that I'm plotting here is the tempo histogram. Okay, so the way this works is that at every time step, you draw a little spike into this buffer at whatever you think the tempo is. And at the next time step, you estimate the tempo again, and you draw a new spike, and you always add the new spike into the buffer. So if you keep getting the same tempo estimate over and over again, then that spike keeps growing as these little spikes add on top of one another. And so in the paper, that's all they do. They just keep accumulating tempo scores. And then at the end, the highest peak wins. But the difference is that in the paper, they're only trying to get a tempo estimate for an entire song. They assume that the tempo doesn't change for the duration of the song, and they just want to go to the end of the song and then see what the tempo was. Whereas I want to keep updating in real time, and the tempo might change. So in my case, I also decay the histogram. And so the whole histogram is basically multiplied by this coefficient at each time step. And so the lower this number is, the more rapidly the histogram will decay. And so I can show you what the effect of that is. It's pretty easy to see if I use a metronome. So here's a metronome at 100 beats a minute. And that 100 BPM spike just grows. And then if I switch to new tempo, that spike decays away and the new spike grows. And at the moment the new spike surpasses the old spike, the tempo estimate down here changes once and for all. Okay, and if I lower this number, that will happen more quickly. Okay, so now I'm getting, okay, so now when I change the tempo, I'm getting a pretty rapid and this works pretty well if you just have a metronome, but for real music, you end up getting a lot of spurious tempo estimates. And so by having this decay more slowly, the spurious tempo estimates will never grow large enough to dominate the tempo estimate as a whole. So yeah, generally this is pretty good. If you have music that you really expect the tempo to be very constant, you don't expect the tempo to change at all, you might actually even raise this. If you put this all the way up to 1, then spurious tempo candidates are minimized as much as they possibly can be. So you can also set the tempo histogram width, and that pertains to the width of these spikes here. So I will raise this and show you what that looks like. So now you have this very wide lobe. And if you just have music that's at a constant tempo, then it really doesn't matter how wide these things are. But if you're changing tempo, then it behaves differently. And in fact, when you have these really broad peaks, what happens is when you change tempo, you tend to sort of roll over to a new tempo. Whereas if the peaks are very narrow, you tend to transition sharply to the new tempo. And in principle, it sounds like this rolling thing might be good, but in practice, what happens is that it just ends up taking longer than it really needs to get there. And I can demonstrate that for you. So this is 119 beats a minute. And then I'll change that to 102. And there, finally 102. So you can see it goes over, but it more and more slowly. And at the end, it takes a long time to get all the way down to 102 there. Whereas if I narrow this window, when I change the tempo, So I'll change it to 119. So this new spike grows, and as soon as that new spike surpasses the old spike in height, then the tempo estimate here changes, and that happens quite rapidly. Okay, so it's generally recommended to keep this pretty small. Okay, log Gaussian tempo weight mean. Okay, so what this is about is that this whole histogram is weighted by log Gaussian window, so that values or tempos in the middle of this are more likely overall than tempos at the edges of this. And maybe I can demonstrate that. I'll play metronome at 75 beats a minute. So this spike stabilizes about yay high. And then if I put this to 100 beats a minute, you can see that peak is a little taller than the 70 beats a minute per peak was. Okay, I haven't moved my mouse. This is where that peak was, and this one is clearly higher. Okay, so the whole thing is being weighted by this window that gives sort of attenuates things at the edges. And the reason for that is that often in real music you'll have two competing tempos where one's, say, double or half of the other one. And this weighting gives preference to the more intermediate tempo. And so by default, the strongest weight is for tempos that are 100 beats a minute. And that works pretty well for most music, but if for some reason you expect to be dealing with a lot of really slow music or a lot of really fast music, then you might consider changing that. There's also log Gaussian tempo weight width, which is just how wide this window is. So if you decrease the width of the window, that has the effect of more strongly attenuating the things at the edges. So in fact, I'll just put this back to 75 beats a minute. And then I'll decrease the width of this window. Okay, so that got strongly attenuated. In fact, it got attenuated so much that now whatever random thing happens may very well take over the true tempo estimate there. So those are all the parameters associated with tempo tracking. So that concludes this video. My next video will be on beat tracking, the moment you've all been waiting for. So yeah, that's it. Have fun, and I'll see you next time.